last week we're continuing chapter 26 in Matthew this week. And so far in 26, we've studied the plot against Jesus. We've seen Jesus be anointed at Bethany. We've studied the excerpts from Matthew 26 about Judas agreeing to betray Jesus and what happened there. And then last week we Kathy covered the Last Supper. And so now we're going to proceed with Jesus predicting Peter's denial. And like with the Last Supper and with the Judas excerpts, what Barclay does here is he kind of pulls together information in chapter 26 specifically related to Peter. And we don't have Bernie here yet, but Bernie said, be careful what you say about my Pope. So we're going to be talking about Peter to get started today. So Sarah is back. So Sarah, do you have your book in front of you?
I have my book. What page are we on?
We are on page 400 and Matthew 26, 31 through 35.
Hey, I've got it. But before I read, I want to just let you know we're elders, so we may just tippy-toe out a little early.
Okay.
And okay. Sarah, before you get going, please look for the Safe Harbor family gifts.
Okay, I found the two that we talked about, and I have not forgotten about the other one.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. Matthew 26, 31 through 35. Then Jesus said to them, every one of you will be made to stumble because of me during this night. For it stands written, I will smite the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered abroad. But after I have been raised, I will go before you into Galilee. Peter answered him, if all are made to stumble because of you, I will never be made to stumble. Jesus said to him, this is the truth I tell you. During this night, before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter said to him, even if I have to die with you, I will not deny you. So spoke all the disciples.
Okay. Barclay talks about characteristics that we see of Jesus that he says are really clear in this passage. He says, for one, Jesus was telling it like it was. He talks about the realism of Jesus, that he knew what was going to happen. And he saw what was coming, but he continued on. And he talks about the confidence of Jesus, that after I'm raised, I'll just see, okay, after all of this is over, see you in Galilee. I'll see you in Galilee. So he always saw beyond what was going to happen and what was coming in the future for them. And then it also talks about the sympathy of Jesus, that he knew his disciples would desert him. He didn't argue with them or condemn them or fuss at them, that he wanted to really, let them know that this is going to happen, but you're going to see me afterwards. And he kind of tells them we're going to meet again. And he says he saw, even though he was going to be seeing them at the worst, that he still loves them. And shows that what Barclay says is that he knows that our weaknesses and mistakes we will make out of a lack of loyalty. But he says Jesus has nothing but sympathy for those who in their weakness are driven to sin. And I kind of liked another statement that he really wasn't condemning the disciples, but he was really showing that he was in command of the situation and that the scriptures had to be fulfilled. When you all read this, what did you think?
It still sort of amazes me that how Jesus was able to predict to the degree that he does the behaviors that he did.
Mhm.
You know, and in some ways I struggle with that. If it was, why did it have to happen that way?
Mhm. And when I go back and read Zechariah, where it talks about striking the shepherd and the sheep of the flock are scattered, you know, if I would read that, I wouldn't have even thought about Jesus, you know, at that time when I was reading the information in context, you know, but Jesus pulls that particular passage out here. Strike the shepherd and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. Do you think that, what if they hadn't been scattered? You know, what if they had all, well, we'll find out a little bit later what happens when one of them actually does strike out, and what Jesus, and Jesus' response to that. He also talks about, go ahead.
At what point did Jesus know his life's outcome? At what point could he foresee what his life's end was going to be?
Well, you know, from the very beginning of Matthew and from the very beginning of a lot of the Gospels, he tells people, this is what's going to happen. You know, that I'm going to die. That I'm not the normal, you know, I don't think he ever saw himself as something different than a sacrificial Messiah. What do you all feel?
I just think that since he is God, he know everything is through him, everything is created by him. So this is something that he actually orchestrated and is now in human form, just fulfilling and being obedient. But he's so vast, and so you know, everything is through him. So he must have known because it's his creation, I guess.
I think he was human too.
Thinking about Mark's gospel, which was the first one written, and other things talked about leading up to this point, that when in Mark's gospel, when Jesus is on the cross, he says, "Why have you forsaken me?" And so I'm not as sure as some of you are that he knew from day one he was going to end up on the cross. I think by this time, he knew he was going to end up on the cross because he was very much a realist, and he knew he had severely angered the people in power, and that that's
so.
Yeah, so I think by this time he knew, but I'm not sure he knew the very first day of his ministry.
Well, in this passage, what Barclay is pulling out here is not just about what Christ's characteristics, but it brings forth Peter. And Bernie, we mentioned we have to be careful now because Peter's your Pope, so we'll be careful. But anyway, it talks about what did we learn from Peter, from what do we feel about Peter from these passages, these verses. It says, you know, even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. Even if everyone else falls away, not me. And we know it from Peter kind of throughout the gospel that we've studied so far, that he's really confident.
I think people have the best intentions, but I think when the rubber meets the road and you're faced with your, you know, being dismembered by an angry crowd, it's not as easy to follow through with your good intentions. And I liked the comment that Jesus has great sympathy for people who sin because of their weakness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I like Peter's confidence.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we know where it's going, but you know, his heart's in the right place. When I was married the first time, first husband told me that not only was there not a stop sign, there wasn't even a yield sign between my brain and my mouth. And I've gotten better. Don't laugh, Nancy. But I see Peter like that. There's not a yield sign. There's not a stop. If he thinks it, he says it. You know exactly where Peter stands. And I like that a lot.
Well, and it's really refreshing kind of, because I think Peter is always kind of like us, you know, he makes the same mistakes and overconfidence, and he loves, you can really tell he loves Jesus.
Was
You
Peter
know.
the first one to actually say, I know who you are, you're the Messiah?
Mhm.
I think so.
He's the first one in writing
Yeah.
or that we see in the Bible that says, you know, I know who you are, you know.
Yeah, Jesus tells him to keep it quiet.
But I think more important, he was comfortable in his convictions.
Uh-huh.
I think that's more important. He was comfortable in his convictions.
Most of the time.
No, he hesitated on some of his actions, but I don't think he swayed or veered that much. So.
If Peter had said when questioned, yeah, I know him, he's a good friend of mine, and I think he's the Messiah, you know, kiss my butt, what would have happened to the rock upon which, you know, Jesus's church was built?
Well, somebody else would have been Pope.
I kind of want to go back to some of our discussion last week. You know, Harold was talking about how Jesus saw his ministry as for the Jews until after the resurrection.
Mhm.
And so, you know, that really got me thinking a lot this past week about that. So that to me, it's like it's a process of discernment. You know, that's a big buzzword in a lot of churches nowadays, in making decisions, a process of discernment. But I don't know of another word to use. You guys might be able to think of a better one, but a process of transformation, of learning, of just, you know, that Jesus was learning too. You know, the Christ part knew what was ahead, but the Jesus part, the human part, was a process of learning, and it was for Peter too. And what got me thinking about that for Peter is, you know, on into Acts, you know, with the whole discussion about whether or not you had to be circumcised to be part of the church.
And to keep kosher, because remember his dream that he
His
could
dream.
eat that,
Right.
yeah.
Right. So it was a process of discernment or transformation or learning or whatever. And I think it is for us too. And it is for the church. And it is that it's not a static process. It's not it's an ongoing process.
Mhm.
You know,
And
they learned and changed. And so do we. I mean, look at where I am today and some of my thoughts and what kinds of things I thought and felt, 40, 50 years ago.
Mhm. And within the last 2 or 3 weeks, I know that we've at one time studied that that Christianity is not a static religion. It's constantly growing and changing, and you have to be adventuresome, and so that's what I think when I see the growth of, well, not the growth, but what Peter's going through, what Christ is going through throughout this gospel.
Mhm. Right.
Any other thoughts about this passage? They do talk about the cock crows. Before the cock crows, that you will disown me 3 times, and we'll discuss that a little bit later as we're talking about Peter. Now, after this particular passage, Barclay skips down to Matthew, like we're on Matthew 35, ending there, and we skip all the way over to 57 for the next reading, 57 through 58 and 69 through 75. But in between that time, what happened? A lot passes. Okay, so after Peter, Jesus tells Peter that he's going to deny him 3 times. They then go to the Garden of Gethsemane. That's when Judas comes and betrays Jesus, and Jesus is arrested, and the disciples desert him and flee. And so Barclay starts the next passage that we're studying with what happens with Peter after that. So if Kathy, do you want to read 26, Matthew 26, 57 through, well, it's the passages on page 402.
Okay. All right. Those who had laid hold of Jesus led him away to the house of Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders were assembled. Peter followed him at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest's house, and he went inside and sat down with the servants to see the end. Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard. A maidservant came up to him and said, "You too were with Jesus the Galilean." He denied it in the presence of them all. "I don't know," he said, "what you are saying." Then he went out to the porch. When he went out to the porch, another maidservant saw him and said to those who were there, "This man too was with Jesus of Nazareth." And again he denied it with an oath, "I do not know the man." A little later, those who were standing there said to Peter, "Truly, you too were one of them, for your accent gives you away." Then he began to curse and to swear, "I do not know the man." And immediately the cock crew. And Peter remembered the saying of Jesus when he said, "Before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly.
Barclay talks about how this really shows how he says how staggeringly honesty, the staggering honesty of the New Testament. That's a mouthful. That why would the author want to show one of the disciples, doing this, 3 times? And it, you would, and the shame that he must have had. And I think he also talks about Peter, let's see, it says Matthew closely follows the narrative of Mark. And in Mark 14, the story is told with even more detail. And it says that Barclay adds that Papias, the 1st century bishop of Hierapolis, tells us that Mark's gospel is nothing other than the preaching material Peter wrote down. So it's amazing that we have this story of Peter's denial, because in Mark, Peter was probably telling this story himself. Okay, he was sharing with everyone about what he did. And he didn't suppress the story. Like, there's some things I might not tell that I did because I might not be too happy with myself for doing them. But here, Peter is really sharing that story. And he says that not only did Peter not suppress the story, he made it an essential part of his gospel for the very best reasons. And it says that every time he told the story, he could say, this is the way that this Jesus can forgive. He forgave me when I failed him in his bitterest hour of need. That is what Jesus can do. Look at me, Peter the coward, and he used even me. But I think that last week, Sarah had mentioned that when she read these passages, she thought about Peter completely differently, you know, and that all of the disciples ran away except who? Peter. Peter followed Jesus. And that takes a lot of courage. And Barclay kind of explains that when he followed Jesus to the high priest's house, that usually the wealthier people had like a complex. It had like a courtyard area surrounded by buildings. And so Peter would be following right into the den of lions, you know, right into an area where people might recognize him, but he followed Jesus and everyone else ran away. So it's and in the denial process, you know, he's in this courtyard area, and it says a maidservant recognized Peter as a disciple and said, hey, you know, I know you, you know, you're a follower of Jesus. And with his first denial, but even after his first and second and denials, he didn't run. He stayed right there. He was either in that courtyard area or on the porch, they call it, or the gateway, you know, for that area. So I had never really thought, you know, about it that way before, that that it took a lot of courage for Peter to do that,
To even go there.
even go there.
Now, one of the things that makes studying any subject challenging is that what's left out, what's not said, can be just as important as what is said. But I'm not real good at figuring out what's not there.
Mhm.
You know, so, you know, for Barclay to say, oh, hey, the other 11 ran away, was an aha moment for me. And it shouldn't have been, because I've been reading this story literally my entire life.
Mhm.
And I'm just now going, oh yeah, they left.
Yeah, I think it's also noteworthy, I think, that when he heard the cock crow, he immediately acknowledged his own fault. He didn't, oh, well, you know, I had to lie because of this, that, and the other thing. There were no excuses. It was just, you know, the immediate internal recognition of what he had done wrong and accepting that he had done wrong.
Mhm.
He owned it.
Right.
Mhm.
You don't see that very much now.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like remembering something that your parents told you, don't do this, you know, and you do something and see the results of what you've done and say, oh, you know, I remember now.
Well, hearkening back to my third grade religion class at Sacred Heart Catholic School, the real story of Peter is in the denouncing is in the forgiveness. That's the number one thing. The number two thing that they used to tell us, and I think they were right, the nuns, was that it was also a sense of one's conscience. Okay, and if you are truly true to yourself and a true believer in say Christ, your conscience will tell you so. It's based on what you know and what you believe in and what your, as I used the word before, what your convictions are. Okay, and people with clear Christian convictions usually have a better conscience than those without. Anyway, that's what I learned every day at between 8:45 and 9:15 for 8 years.
A well-spent half hour, may I say.
That and how to say altar boy prayers in Latin.
And how many of us can even remember what we learned between 8 and 9 o'clock, you know?
Right,
Oh,
and
they
then you
drag
learned
you-
all those prayers in Latin, and then Vatican Council happened, and they all got switched to English.
Well, they made sure you were awake because they dragged you to your seat by your ear. And I learned in first grade that where my ear goes, I go.
Well, you remembered what you learned 40 years ago, but what have you learned this morning?
That I made a great cup of coffee.
But that's a good point, Bernie, and I hadn't really thought about that, not in a conscious kind of way, that this is a wonderful conscience story.
Yes,
Mhm,
that's what they beat into us.
right. But I
believe
think
it.
also courage, because I mean, the very first person that comes to him and says, I know you, you know, I know you, and he could have gone, he could have left, he could have fled, you know, to save his life. Who knows what could have happened, but he stuck around.
But he immediately wept. And that was the real
At the third,
awareness. He knew it, he had it, he owned it.
at the
And,
third night, when the cock crowed.
Right. He
Yeah.
immediately wept and he knew it. And that's why I said he was pretty firm in what he believed in. He just was very human also.
Mhm. Yeah.
Because I don't know that I've used Peter and role model in the same sentence before, but he
Well,
is.
you don't believe in him as the Pope, and that's why.
He's right up there.
Good.
I don't denounce popes.
As a priest told me one time in a service as he was giving me a blessing instead of communion, we'll get you back. He did. Jamie laughed her, well, you know what, off. She did. Heard it. So,
Yeah.
all right.
Barclay
Continue.
does, go ahead.
No, continue.
Barclay does talk a little bit about the cock crow. And in some passages you hear rooster crowing, but here I think Barclay has cock crow. And he talks about the, I think we've studied this before a little bit, about that the Romans had 4 separate watches, 6 to 9, 9 to midnight, midnight to 3, and 3 to 6. And usually between the 3rd and the 4th was early on, he said that's when a cock was supposed to crow, was between, so it was sometime at daybreak. But we've also studied before that it may be that the cock crow wasn't a actual rooster, that the house of the high priest was right in the center of Jerusalem, and it's unlikely that there would be poultry in the city, in the center of the city. And I don't know whether or not, I can't imagine not having chickens in the city.
I was once on the subway in New York City, and a woman sat down next to me with a bag that moved. And I later discovered that she wanted a very fresh chicken for dinner. So there are chickens in the middle of the city.
And Barclay adds that there was a regulation in Jewish law that it was illegal to keep cocks and hens in the holy city because they defiled holy things. But the hour of 3 a.m. was called cock crow because at that hour the Roman guards changed at the castle of Antonia, and the sign of the changing of the guards was a trumpet blast. And so the Latin word for that stands for cock crow. And so it could be a rooster, it could have been a trumpet blast. It really doesn't matter what it was. You know, it was whatever Jesus said it was, and Peter heard it, and that made him remember everything. It's not sure what happened to Peter after he went away. When is the next time? I forget when is the next time we actually hear from Peter. But we'll see as we proceed.
I don't think we hear
So
from him again
Pardon?
Right, I'm looking to see when we hear from Peter again, so keep going.
But he says that the lasting impression for the whole story shouldn't be that we see Peter as a coward, but we see him as courageous. He did go, he stuck with Christ, and we see Peter's love for Christ, because otherwise, he wouldn't have felt and had taken the actions that he did with following him. And so any other comments here, because we're going to kind of go back now. Remember, we skipped the Garden of Gethsemane to kind of put Peter's picture together here. And so the next reading is from Matthew 26, 36 through 46 in Gethsemane. I don't know if someone can read that.
I got it.
Okay, thank you.
Then Jesus went with them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go away and pray in this place." So he took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee and began to be distressed and in sore trouble. Then he said to them, "My soul is much distressed with distress like death. Stay here and watch with me." He went a little way forward and fell on his face in prayer. "My Father," he said, "if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, but let it be not as I will, but as you will." He came to his disciples and he found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "Could you not stay awake with me for 1 hour? Watch and pray lest you enter into testing. The spirit is eager, but the flesh is weak." He went away a second time and prayed. "My Father," he said, "if it is not possible for this to pass from me unless I drink it, your will be done." He came again and found them sleeping, for their eyes were weighted down. He left them and went away again and prayed the third time, saying the same words over again. Then he came to his disciples and said to them, "Sleep on now and take your rest. Look you, the hour is near, and the Son of Man is being delivered into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Look you, he who betrays me is near."
Oh, the wine from that Seder dinner was really kicking in.
Hmm.
They had a hard day. They were tired. Barclay talks about that the garden itself, that there weren't really, and I think that Kathy or Sarah in the last 2 weeks, I think one of you was talking about the garden, and that there was really no gardens within the city of Jerusalem, that that all of the gardens, the wealthy people would have their gardens on top of the Mount of Olives. And so that's where they would have their private gardens. And they say that Gethsemane actually may mean something like an olive vat or an olive press, that particular word. So Barclay says it's no doubt that it was a garden of olives where Jesus was given the right to enter by some nameless person. Someone had given him the right, just like someone gave him a donkey to ride in Jerusalem, and someone gave him the upper room to have the Last Supper. And we know the person that's named who gave him the tomb that he eventually was laid in. So he had a lot of people in that city who, supported him and were able to provide for him. And they had to have been wealthier people, possibly also. So, and I hadn't really realized this before, but the people, I think it says he took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee along with him when he went to pray. And I didn't realize before, but Barclay is saying that these are the same three disciples who went with him on the Mount of Transfiguration. So he called the same three people to go to pray with him in the garden and saw the transfiguration. were you aware of that? I hadn't
I
realized
hadn't
that.
put that
before.
together until I read that also. Yeah.
But this is really where I see Jesus as kind of questions that I might ask if I were put in that situation. You know, are you really sure, God? You know, you really sure you want me to do this? And prays 3 times, you know, same number of times that Peter is going to deny him. So it's a are you sure that, you know, he's questioning. And, you know, you go to your parents and say, you know, do you really want me to do this? And yet he always follows up with, but not my will, but your will be done.
Again, it strikes me again that Barclay's point about the honesty of the New Testament. Because I always, you know, I've thought of the Old Testament as being honest, you know, as far as like David's not so good qualities about David and things he's done and he did and stuff, but that is in the New Testament as well. And the stories about Peter and Jesus.
Yeah. And I think that previously when I think when in the end, when it says, rise and let's go, here comes my betrayer, kind of a thing, they say that there was someone who actually used that to say that Jesus was going to run away, you know, whereas it isn't the fact that Jesus was saying, come on, get up, it's time to get started with this. This is where it begins at the end. So he was in agony, and it has I don't know that I read it here, but when it says Peter took, and he here, be troubled, he said, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me. Is there one point where he was supposed to sweat blood? Was that in this part, that was in this story in another gospel?
All right.
I think that's in
Luke.
Is that in John? I'm looking for it.
Yeah. But it talked about the agony of Jesus, that he knew what was coming. He was relatively young person, you know, in his early 30s, and he was preparing to die on the cross. And he could have changed his mind. You know, I think of Peter, you know, denying and then making it real, and then realizing, and Jesus,
Luke.
you know, just accepting.
Yeah, it's in Luke.
Mm-hmm.
That it says, in his anguish, he prayed even more earnestly, and his sweat fell to the ground like great drops of blood.
Like great drops of blood.
Yeah. And looking at the other gospels backing up to Peter, in Matthew and Mark, after the denial, Peter is not referred to by name. In Luke and John, he is referred to, you know, as going to the tomb.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So Barclay talks about the agony of Jesus, the loneliness of Jesus, and the trust in Jesus, and that is shown in these verses. That he took 3 exhausted disciples with him. They keep falling asleep, so he's there to really fight the battle, you know, on his own. And he says it's true for us all. Certain things we must face, certain decisions we must make alone with the help of Jesus. And he talks a little bit about the trust of Jesus and he talks about Jesus using the word Abba for father here, and talks about how Abba is a word that a young child might call, his father. So it's an everyday family word, which no one had ventured to use. If you remember, being a Jewish person, you don't even say the word, God, isn't it Yahweh?
Yahweh.
Whatever.
Yeah.
And here he's calling him by a very familiar family kind of name. And, I always thought it's like when you call your father daddy or dad, and how familiar that is with that. So he spoke to God in a childlike, trustful, intimate way, as a child would to their father. Even when their father, just like I think of Abraham taking Isaac, to sacrifice. And luckily with that, God finally says, no, you don't have to do that. But he was willing and ready to do that. And here God is doing it with his son too. I don't know, it's a really hard passage to read and think about, him going through this, but he's got a lot worse to go through, coming up. But this is where the decision's made, that he's going to accept, because he could have said, nope, I'm not going to do this. And he could have gotten out of there. He could have left the garden. He would have had people to hide him. He's escaped many other times in many other places where you thought that they were going to be grabbing him and arresting him in some way. Any other thoughts about this passage or questions we should bring up?
And the thought just occurred to me, there's what, 2 million people in Jerusalem for Passover? So he could easily have hid. There wasn't social media and camera phones
It was
then.
dark. It was dark too. He could have gotten out of there. But if he did, where would we be?
Right.
We'd be pagans.
Or Jews. No, we'd be pagans. You're right. We'd be pagans.
Or Muslims.
Yeah, could be. Could be. But here's the point. Talk about the courage of Jesus. Rise and let us be going, Jesus said. He who betrays me is near. And it says there was a pagan philosopher who attacked Christianity using this sentence as an argument that Jesus tried to run away. But Barclay says the opposite happened. The time for prayer and the time for the garden is past. No time. It's the time for action. Let us face life at its grimmest and human beings at their worst. So he says, Jesus rose from his knees to go out to battle, to the battle of life. That's what prayer is for. So prayer is for us to be able to get on our knees and pray and get up and face and be able to face life, the things that we have to deal with. He also says in prayer, we enter heaven that we may face the battles of earth. So is that how you view prayer?
I never thought of it as entering heaven. I have to ruminate on that one.
Okay. And then after this reading, after he gets up and says and gets ready to go to the next reading that we have, then in between there we have the passage that we studied earlier, where Matthew 26:47 through 49, Jesus is arrested while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. So Judas arrives, and a large crowd, armed crowd, comes with him, and he betrays him with a kiss. And then Jesus then responds in the next passage that we have, which is Matthew 26, 50 through 56.
I'll read it.
Okay, thank you.
Then they came forward and laid hands on Jesus and held him. So I guess they is the crowd that was there. And look you, good old Barclays, look you, one of these who was with Jesus stretched out his hand and drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Then Jesus said to him, "Put back your sword in its place. For all who take the sword shall perish by the sword. Or do you not think that I am able to call on my Father, and he will on the spot send to my aid more than 12 regiments of angels? How then are the scriptures to be fulfilled that it must happen so?" And at that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out with swords and cudgels to arrest me as against a brigand? Daily I am sat teaching in the temple, and you did not lay hold of me. All of this has happened that the writings of the prophets might be fulfilled." Then all his disciples forsook him and fled.
Okay.
Hmm.
So they were wondering, Barclay questions, it was Judas who gave, could it have been Judas who gave the authorities? These people had to find him somehow. I mean, Judas was coming with him, but he was in the garden, and they said that the people that the Jewish authorities would have had available was the temple police under the command of the captain of the temple. But there was also a mob that was apparently coming with them. And it says it was more like a lynching than an orderly arrest that was taking place. But Jesus wouldn't allow any kind of resistance. And Matthew tells us that one of the disciples drew a sword and wounded the servant of the high priest. John, actually, in John 18, they say that that particular disciple was Peter.
Right, that's right. So,
They say John was written much later, but then when Matthew was written, it says and he's speculating, it still may not have been safe to name the disciple who defended Jesus. And if it was Peter, this is another example of courage displayed by Peter, willing to take on the mob and follow Jesus right to, and then afterward follow the group to the high priest's home. And I don't know if anyone would agree that it was Peter, or we don't know who it was. It was one of the disciples.
And my Bible just says one of the followers. It doesn't say disciples, it says just one of the followers.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, one of Jesus' companions reached for his sword. Yeah. So who knows? Someone did. And in the movie, when I saw the movie, Jesus put the ear back on the servant.
Ooh.
Is that actually in any of the Gospels, or was that just one of those things that we think happened because we've seen it in movies or books or what have you?
I don't know that I've ever read it.
I thought it was in one of the,
Is it?
I don't know.
I'm going to guess that if it was, it would be in John. So let me look at John. John 18.
And while she's doing that, what Barclay says is that we learn two things from this passage: that death was his own choice, He didn't have to come to Jerusalem. Wouldn't have had to come to Jerusalem for the Passover. Having come, he didn't have to deliberately defy the Jewish leaders that were there. And he spent all of chapter 24 or 25 doing that, if we remember. And even in the garden, as we mentioned, he could have slipped away. So every step of the last days makes it clear that Jesus laid down his life, and it wasn't taken from him. Jesus died because he chose to die. Okay. And just a few verses earlier, he was really questioning, are you sure you want me to do this? But that's what his
verses earlier, you talk about the prophecies.
Mhm.
So the prophecies can be fulfilled.
Right. He has to fulfill the prophecies.
Right.
Prophecies have to be fulfilled.
So it in Luke 22, 51, but Jesus said, don't resist anymore. And he touched the place where the man's ear had been and healed him.
It was right. It was actual footage.
You know, at this point, if I am part of the angry mob and I see that, that's when I say, sorry to disturb, I'm out.
Whoops.
I know. You see a miraculous healing and you're going to say, yeah, let's get him. I don't think so.
Yeah, I'm bad.
Right. And then in John,
Change my mind.
it says that Peter was the one who had the sword and cut off the high priest servant's ear. The servant's name was Malchus. And Jesus said to Peter, put your sword back in its scabbard. Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me? All right. So it's in Luke that he touched the guy and healed him. Okay.
That's good.
Luke,
Good.
being a doctor, I guess, would have noted that.
Yeah. Yeah.
If
He
he
had
wasn't.
advantages.
The nuns taught me right.
What did they teach you on that?
that the ear was reattached.
Yeah. And then lastly, Barclay says he chose to die because he knew that death was the purpose of God. That it's the very thing foretold by the prophets. He took it that violence only begets violence. All who take the sword shall perish by the sword. Jesus knew that war and power settle nothing, but produce even more war and power. He knew that God's purpose can be worked out only by sacrificial love. And Barclay says that history's proven him right.
All right, Stuart gave us a thumbs up.
Yep.
See, there's your little thumbs up there.
That's right. And
So I
it's
give
not
a thumbs up too.
okay. It is already 10:54. We are already late. So
Thank you,
we'll see all
Susan.
in church,
Thank you,
and,
Susan.
we'll be
Thank you.
Susan.